The United Arab Emirates is one of the wealthiest and most modern nations on Earth, a country of gleaming skyscrapers, vast air-conditioned shopping malls, and supermarket shelves that overflow with an almost bewildering abundance of food from every corner of the planet. Walk into a grocery store in Dubai or Abu Dhabi, and you will find fresh fruit from Africa, meat from Australia, rice from Asia, dairy from Europe, and produce from the Americas, all of it available, all of it affordable, all year round. But behind that gleaming abundance lies a startling and deeply precarious truth, one that the country's polished surface works hard to conceal. The way grows almost none of it. Roughly 90% of everything the nation eats is imported, carried in by ship and by plane across thousands of miles of ocean and sky. And the water its people drink is not drawn from any river or natural spring, but wrung from the salty sea at tremendous cost and effort. Here is a country of some 10 million people living in a harsh desert that simply cannot feed them or water them on its own. A nation whose entire sustenance hangs upon an unbroken chain of ships, ports, pipelines, and distant global markets. Which raises a genuinely unsettling question. What happens if that chain breaks? How close is this glittering nation, in truth, to a crisis? This is the story of the UAE's profound dependence on the outside world for its most basic needs, and the extraordinary lengths to which it is going to keep catastrophe at arm's length. Let us begin with the sheer scale of that dependence, because it is difficult to overstate. When a country imports around 90% of its food, it means that only about 1 bite in 10 of everything consumed within its borders is actually produced there. The other 9 come from somewhere else. This is one of the highest rates of food import dependence anywhere in the world, and the reasons for it are written into the very landscape of the country. The UAE is a desert nation in one of the most extreme environments on the planet. Less than 1% of its land is arable, capable of supporting crops. Its summers routinely exceed 50 degrees Celsius, hot enough to wither most plants and exhaust most livestock. Its annual rainfall barely reaches 100 millimeters, a tiny fraction of what conventional agriculture requires. And its soils are often saline, poisoned with salt that kills ordinary crops. In short, nature has dealt the UAE one of the worst possible hands for growing food. And its population, already around 10 million, is projected to swell toward 15 million or more by the middle of the century, which means the demand for food will only grow even as the land remains as barren as ever. It is a nation whose appetite vastly and permanently exceeds what its own soil can provide. Now consider the second half of the equation, the water. Because here the story is subtly different but no less precarious, and honesty requires precision about it. Unlike its food, the UAE does not, strictly speaking, import most of its drinking water. Instead, it manufactures it. The UAE is one of the most water-scarce countries in the entire world, with almost no natural, renewable fresh water to speak of. So to supply its cities, its people, and its industries, the nation relies overwhelmingly on desalination, the process of taking seawater from the Persian Gulf and stripping the salt out of it to render it drinkable. So while the water itself is made at home, the ability to make it depends entirely on a continuous, massive supply of energy, and on the sophisticated infrastructure that turns brine into drinking water. Meanwhile, the country's limited underground water reserves are being drained at an alarming rate. The water table is dropping by roughly a meter every year, and by some estimates, the UAE could exhaust its natural fresh groundwater within about 50 years. So whether we are talking about food, which is imported, or water, which is manufactured from the sea using imported energy, the conclusion is the same. The most basic sustenance of this nation rests upon foundations that reach far beyond its own borders. To appreciate the vulnerability this creates, you have to picture the extraordinary logistical chain that keeps the country fed each and every day. Every single day, an immense river of food flows into the UAE. Refrigerated container ships laden with meat and produce dock at its ports. Cargo planes packed with perishables land at its airports. Trucks distribute it all to the warehouses and supermarkets that keep the shelves stocked. It is a genuine marvel of modern logistics, a precisely choreographed dance of global commerce that most residents never even think about as they fill their shopping carts. But every marvel of this kind is also, by its very nature, a long and intricate chain. And a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. This particular chain depends on stable global food markets, on functioning international shipping, and, most critically of all, on the geography of the region in which the OA sits. Because a great deal of the trade that sustains the country flows through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow neck of water at the mouth of the Persian Gulf that is one of the most strategically vital and most contested maritime chokepoints anywhere on Earth. Through that slender passage moves not only much of the world's oil, but a substantial share of the goods that feed the UAE, and that concentration of dependence on a single vulnerable waterway is the great structural weakness lurking beneath all the abundance. So what exactly could break the chain? This is where the phrase "one crisis away" begins to take on real meaning, because there are several distinct kinds of disruption that could each, in their own way, threaten the flow of food and the supply of water. The first and most obvious is a regional conflict, or a blockade, particularly one that closed or disrupted the Strait of Hormuz. If that choke point were to seize up, the effects on the UAE's imports could be swift and severe. The second is a global food shock, a sudden disruption to the world's food supply that sends prices soaring or makes key staples scarce, as happens during major wars or crop failures in the great agricultural exporting nations. The third is a broad supply chain disruption of the kind the whole world experienced during the coronavirus pandemic, when shipping snarled, borders tightened, and the smooth flow of global goods stuttered. And the fourth is an energy disruption, which matters enormously because energy is what powers the desalination plants. Threaten the energy supply, and you threaten not just the food, but the very water. Because the UAE imports around 90% of its food and manufactures its water using enormous amounts of energy, a large enough disruption to global trade, to regional shipping, or to energy supplies could place real pressure on both its food and its water security, and could do so with alarming speed. That is the vulnerability at the heart of the matter, and crucially, this is not some far-fetched hypothetical nightmare. The chain has already been tested, and repeatedly, in just the last few years. When the coronavirus pandemic struck, it sent shockwaves through global supply chains and gave the UAE a sharp, frightening glimpse of how exposed it truly was, prompting a serious national reckoning with the problem. Then came the war in Ukraine, which, because Russia and Ukraine together account for a very large share of the world's wheat and grain exports, sent global wheat prices soaring by roughly 60% in a matter of weeks, driving home just how vulnerable an import-dependent nation is to distant conflicts. And more recently still, tensions and disruption around the Strait of Hormuz have delivered yet another sustained, direct stress test of the country's preparedness. So the scenario we are describing is not a matter of if, but rather a recurring reality that the UAE has been forced to confront again and again. Each of these crises pulled hard on the chain, testing whether it would hold. The war in Ukraine is especially worth dwelling on because it illustrates so clearly how a conflict thousands of miles away can reach directly into the kitchens of an import-dependent nation. Russia and Ukraine are agricultural giants, together supplying a very large portion of the wheat that feeds much of the world, along with substantial quantities of corn, barley, and cooking oils. When the war disrupted their exports, the effect rippled outward across the entire globe almost instantly, and countries that relied on imported grain suddenly found themselves competing for a shrunken supply at rapidly rising prices. For a nation like the UAE, which grows almost no grain of its own, this was a direct and immediate threat to a dietary staple, driven entirely by events over which it had no control whatsoever. It was a vivid demonstration that food import dependence is not merely an economic abstraction, but a genuine strategic exposure, one that can be triggered by a distant war, a failed harvest, or an export ban imposed by a supplier nation protecting its own people. The lesson was impossible to miss. In a globalized food system, no import-dependent nation is truly insulated from the troubles of the wider world, and the UAE, more exposed than almost anyone, absorbed that lesson keenly. And here is the genuinely important part, the part that a purely alarmist telling of this story would leave out. So far, the chain has held. The UAE has weathered each of these crises without descending into the food shortages or the collapse that its raw dependence might lead you to expect. And it has done so not by luck, but by design, through years of deliberate, expensive, and quite sophisticated preparation. This is where the story turns from one of pure vulnerability to one of active, determined management. The UAE is acutely aware of its precarious position, perhaps more aware than almost any other nation on Earth, and it has responded with a comprehensive strategy to keep catastrophe at bay. The centerpiece of that strategy is the maintenance of strategic food reserves, stockpiles of essential commodities established under law after the shock of the pandemic. Reserves that are thought to be sufficient to cover at least 4 months of the country's consumption. That buffer means that even if the flow of imports were seriously disrupted, the nation would not go hungry overnight. It would have a cushion of months in which to adapt and respond. Beyond the reserves, the UAE has pursued a whole portfolio of measures to reduce and manage its vulnerability. It launched an ambitious national food security strategy with the stated aim of becoming one of the most food-secure countries in the world, and it created a dedicated food security council to coordinate the response of ministries, regulators, and private companies, so that when a crisis hits, the relationships and channels needed to respond are already in place and functioning. It has aggressively diversified the sources of its imports, signing a large number of comprehensive economic partnership agreements with countries around the world, so that it is never dangerously dependent on any single supplier or region. If one source is cut off, others can take up the slack. It has invested heavily in becoming a global hub for food trade and logistics, leveraging its world-class ports and its strategic location to give itself greater control over the flow of food through the region. And it has poured resources into boosting whatever domestic production is possible in its hostile environment, embracing cutting-edge techniques like vertical farming, controlled environment agriculture, hydroponics, and advanced aquaculture. Technologies that can grow food indoors in stacked trays, using far less water and land than traditional farming. These measures cannot make a desert self-sufficient, but they can chip away at the dependence and add resilience at the margins. The push into high-technology farming deserves a closer look because it represents one of the most creative parts of the UAE's response, even if its ultimate scale is limited. In a country where open-field agriculture is nearly impossible, the answer has been to bring the farm indoors and to control every variable. Vertical farms grow leafy greens in stacked layers inside climate-controlled warehouses, using specially tuned artificial light and a small fraction of the water that conventional farming demands, with much of that water recirculated rather than lost to the desert air. Hydroponic and other soilless systems sidestep the problem of the country's salty, barren soil entirely by growing plants in nutrient-enriched water. Advanced aquaculture facilities raise fish in carefully managed tanks. These operations can produce genuinely useful quantities of certain fresh foods right in the heart of the desert, close to where they are consumed, reducing the reliance on imports for at least some categories of produce. But it is important to be clear-eyed about their limits. Such methods work best for high-value, fast-growing crops like leafy greens and herbs. They are far less suited to producing the bulk staples, the wheat, the rice, the grains that form the caloric foundation of the diet and that must still be imported in enormous quantities. So while this technological farming is impressive, it addresses the edges of the problem rather than its core. The proof of this preparation lies in how the country has actually performed under pressure. During the recent disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz, the UAE's response was measured and coordinated rather than panicked. Authorities reinforced the strategic reserves, tightened oversight of the markets to prevent hoarding and profiteering, and imposed price controls on essential goods to keep them affordable. Logistics operators adapted to the shifting shipping routes, and retailers drew on their diversified sources of supply and their buffer stocks to keep the shelves stocked. The system, in other words, worked, precisely because it had been built and rehearsed in advance. This is a crucial point, and it deserves real credit. The UAE has demonstrated that a nation can be extraordinarily dependent on food imports and still be remarkably resilient, provided it invests seriously and intelligently in managing that dependence. Vulnerability and resilience, it turns out, are not the same thing, and a country can carry a great deal of the former while building an impressive amount of the latter. So this brings us to the honest and balanced answer to the question we began with. Just how close is the way to collapse? The truthful response is more nuanced and frankly more interesting than the stark headline suggests. On one hand, the underlying vulnerability is undeniably real and severe. Importing 90% of your food while sitting in a politically unstable region, dependent on a single critical choke point and on energy-hungry desalination for your very water, is a genuine and serious strategic liability, one that few other wealthy nations face to anything like the same degree. On the other hand, the phrase "one crisis away from collapse" overstates the immediate danger, because the country has deliberately built real buffers against exactly that outcome. Months of strategic reserves, diversified supply lines, sophisticated logistics, and a coordinated national response mechanism. So the most accurate way to describe the UAE's situation is not as a nation teetering on the very edge of a cliff, but as a nation running very hard and spending very heavily to stay ahead of a vulnerability it can never fully escape. Its buffers buy it months of breathing room, not permanent immunity. A short or moderate crisis it can absorb, but a sufficiently severe and prolonged crisis, a lengthy closure of the strait combined perhaps with a simultaneous global food shock, could eventually strain even those carefully built defenses. The country is not on the brink, but it can never afford to stop running. It helps to put the UAE's predicament in a wider context, because it is far from alone in facing this kind of challenge, and the comparison is genuinely illuminating. Consider Singapore, another wealthy, densely populated nation that, like the UAE, imports roughly 90% of its food. And yet Singapore is consistently ranked among the most food-secure countries in the entire world. How can a nation import almost all of its food and still be considered highly food secure? The answer is that it has focused relentlessly on resilience rather than on the impossible dream of self-sufficiency. It diversifies its sources, maintains buffers, and squeezes the maximum possible production from its tiny footprint of available land. Singapore's example proves an important and reassuring point. Import dependence by itself does not doom a country to insecurity. What truly matters is not whether you import your food, but how wisely and how robustly you manage the fact that you do. The way, in following a broadly similar path, is pursuing a strategy that has been shown to work. And yet, for all this reassurance, we should not let the story swing too far in the comforting direction either, because there remain hard limits that no amount of clever management can entirely erase. Strategic reserves, however substantial, are finite. They buy months, not years, and a crisis that outlasts them would still bite hard. Desalination depends on energy, and energy has its own supply chains and its own vulnerabilities, so the water security rests on foundations that can themselves be shaken. And domestic food production, even with the most advanced technology and the most ambitious targets, will only ever supply a fraction of the total demand of a growing population in a desert. And much of that production itself relies on desalinated water and imported energy, meaning that even the food grown at home is, at a deeper level, still tethered to the outside world. The region, too, remains genuinely unstable, and the Strait of Hormuz remains a permanent point of potential failure that no strategy can fully neutralize. So the vulnerability can be buffered, managed, and pushed further into the future, but it cannot be eliminated. The way has bought itself time, resilience, and breathing room, but it has not bought, and perhaps cannot ever buy, true and complete independence from the world beyond its shores. Ultimately, the way stands as the most extreme and vivid example of a challenge that, in one form or another, faces a great many nations in our deeply interconnected world. In a globalized age, almost every country depends on trade for at least some portion of its food, its energy, or its essential resources. Very few are truly self-sufficient. The way simply represents the sharpest, most visible edge of this reality. A fabulously wealthy nation that has built a life of dazzling abundance atop a foundation it does not fully control and could not fully replace. Its situation offers a preview of the pressures that a warming climate, a more unstable geopolitics, and the growing scarcity of land, water, and resources are beginning to place on food systems everywhere. And its response, the reserves, the diversification, the relentless investment in domestic innovation, may well become a model that other nations, facing their own versions of this squeeze, will need to study and adapt in the years ahead. In watching the way manage its precariousness, we are watching a preview of a challenge that is coming, in some measure, for us all. So, is the UAE truly one crisis away from collapse? The honest answer is that it is one of the most import-dependent and water-scarce nations on the planet, perched in an unstable region beside a fragile choke point, which places it in a precarious position it can never escape. But it is also a nation acutely conscious of that precariousness. One that has spent enormous sums and enormous effort to build the reserves, the supply lines, and the domestic capacity needed to keep its shelves stocked and its taps flowing through crisis after crisis, and that has, so far, succeeded in doing exactly that through a pandemic, a grain shock, and a choke point crisis alike. It is therefore not a nation standing helpless at the edge of ruin, but a nation running hard and spending lavishly to stay a comfortable step ahead of a danger it knows it can never entirely outrun. It has not solved its dependence on the outside world. It has learned, at great cost, to manage it. And the day that management finally fails, the day a crisis arrives too large or too long for even those deep reserves to absorb, would be the day the desert reminds this glittering nation of the one truth all its wealth has never quite changed, that a country which cannot feed or water itself from its own land is only ever as secure as the wider world is willing and able to allow it to be.